Thanks everybody for joining our Coffee Talk session here today. Today we're going to be discussing how to drive effective collaboration between Treasury and IT to enable your bank connectivity strategy. There's a lot happening in the bank connectivity space, both in terms of the technologies, the ways corporates are connecting up with their banks, as well as the broader trends that are really putting a focus on this topic recently. And we're going to cover both angles. There's a lot to discuss here. There's a lot of ground to cover, and obviously it's a pretty technical topic. So I'm very happy to have a couple of experts in the field joining me today. Craig Jeffrey, Managing Partner from Strategic Treasury, as well as Patrick Coons, Managing Director from CUNA Treasury and Finance. Guys, welcome to the Coffee Talk. Maybe you could take a minute here to introduce yourself as well, starting with Patrick.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. So my name is Patrick Coons. I'm Managing Director of CUNA Treasury and Finance, a boutique consultancy firm based out of the Netherlands, focusing on treasury management and interim management in the treasury field. Obviously, we do also do a lot of implementations and selections, RPs. So I've become 50% an IT manager in some of those. So technical knowledge is inevitable in this one.
So moving across the Atlantic over to Atlanta, Georgia, Craig Jeffrey, the Managing Partner of Strategic Treasury. We're a consultancy and a research firm. I'm glad to be here talking on these topics with the two of you. Looking forward to the discussion. You know, there's so much changing with tech, and there's always a lot changing with tech, and just being able to talk about it is both fun and I think helpful to us and everybody who's listening.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. Now, as mentioned, this is a pretty technical topic to address for most corporates out there, and maybe just to set the stage, to touch on some of the aspects we're going to be discussing or bringing up time and time again throughout the discussion points. Maybe we could just talk about what those specific technical aspects are that are typically addressed between Treasury and IT during a project like this, when they're putting in place bank connectivity and handling things like bank-specific formats. And Patrick, maybe I'll go with you to you for first words on this point here.
Yeah. Well, it's often the boring topic and the must talk about topic, but it's in the end a quite important one. What I always do is I already involve IT during the selection phase, and sometimes the client is surprised by that. But the reason why I do that is to avoid surprises later in the process, where IT is even going to tell the project manager or tell Treasury, hey guys, we're not supporting this, or we can't even do this, or we have no resources to do it, because you need the IT resources, and you need to be aware of the IT policies of the client, which can be vital. We're going to talk later more about it, but most tech will be cloud-based. Cloud-based means not the client servers, but an external server. But it's going to be your data on their server, which is quite critical. So you have to be critical about your data. Where is it? What's the location of the data center? Is it in Europe? Is it in the US? Is it in Asia? Key item for most treasuries in Europe. Somehow they prefer the data center to be based in Europe. And even the country matters, because there are different data protection rules in place for every European country. So that's a key item, but also involving the IT managers on the ERP side. That might be different people who need to be involved. And the key question which I would ask is, what are your key questions from IT during the RP process? Which ones do you need answered? Which ones are nice to have, which ones are need to knows, and which are going to be the deal breakers during the selection phase. If a certain question is a no, then it's going to be a no for the whole system, for example. And often there are one or two of those from my IT aspect, and similarly from the ERP system. And the final question I would ask internally with IT is, do you have sufficient resources from an IT perspective to support the Treasury Department making this project work? Because if you only have Treasury resources, the project is just not going to work, or it's going to be delayed. That's my experience.
Yep, not a lot of great points there. A lot of those come up time and time again in all the projects that we do, particularly the one you brought up about GDPR and data privacy and European companies, needing or having a preference to host that data, on European servers. So definitely an important one that definitely pops up on all IT security sort of reviews that we do. Craig, I don't know if you have any other points to maybe add in terms of what Treasury and IT is kind of discussing and determining during a bank connectivity project.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too as you look at, let's just say, not necessarily complexity of companies, but the size of companies and the maturity of their IT group. So, as you're talking about what are your standards in IT, a company, and I'll just use these as a data point, under $1 billion, they're oftentimes, whatever makes sense. As you get a little larger, they may have more specifics. Once they get, over 5 or 10 billion in annual revenue, they may have, plans for an API gateway. They may have plans for how they're managing data, their data lake, so connectivity is the funnel and the channel for data. And so it's pretty important to know what they're planning on doing. They may have grand plans that work against what you're trying to do or that you can align with. That's the other piece too, to understand what they're doing. They're oftentimes looking for someone who can be a pilot for what their plans are. If they're paying an API gateway, that's a different discussion than, for most companies, smaller companies. So those are a couple points.
Yeah, for sure. API gateway versus like a host-to-host connection is totally different class of projects, obviously. But I think in general, IT is always going to want to know what that connectivity looks like. How's it authenticated? How's it secured, right? Is it a host-to-host connection? Is it a Swift connection? Is it an API? How do we make sure it's a secure connection? How is data transmitted across it, right? What are the flows of data? How is that secured? How is it encrypted? What formats are we going to need to contemplate? How much work is this going to be for us upfront and on an ongoing basis? And of course, all the data storage and data privacy concerns as well that Patrick brought up already are key ones for the IT department as well. So I think it's just helpful to set the stage a bit because a lot of these teams are going to come up time and time again throughout this conversation in terms of this collaboration, what we really mean by it for Treasury and IT. I had mentioned in the introduction here that there's a lot of different topics that are really bringing this into the forefront for corporates. We're hearing a lot of, I guess, ongoing projects for bank connectivity or people really thinking about their strategy for the next, 3 to 5 years. And some of the ones that definitely come into mind for me are, ISO 20022 migration, right? That's sort of people preparing for that new standard to come on board when it actually does sort of roll out to corporates. Another one is, leveraging open banking APIs, which is a topic that's coming up time and time again for corporates as they want to sort of explore the use cases around open banking APIs as the next generation of connections to their banking partners. And maybe the biggest one is cloud ERP migrations, where there's a lot of companies out there that are migrating to one centralized cloud ERP system, maybe from multiple different regionalized systems. And part of that project is really considering how they're going to connect that ERP system up to the bank, because obviously that's the engine that sort of fuels all the downstream financial processes. So lots of conversations going on around those 3 topics in general. And I don't know, guys, if you had any others to add in there as well, but I thought maybe we could go through and maybe give a couple different perspectives on some of those big industry trends, maybe starting with Craig here. And if we could kind of bifurcate it a bit to give like the US perspective and the European perspective on some of these topics, I think it'd be helpful for the audience, although I know you guys both take a global view of these topics in general. But yeah, maybe we could start with Craig.
Yeah, I don't know that I was voted to be the U.S. representative or the North American representative, but I'll try to share some common things from there. If there is a vote, I'll let you know. No, you brought up a lot of really, really good points. There is changes being forced upon us, and you're either reacting to it more quickly or more slowly. Cloud migration, there's so many. We're moving to S/4HANA with SAP. We're moving to Oracle Cloud. We're putting in a different accounting system that's, fully cloud-based. All of those changes interact with bank data and interact with payments. And so there's changes that are taking place. So the plumbing needs to change. That's one of the changes forced upon us. The ISO 20022, I would say one thing that I've seen is, except for the most international companies, if they're headquartered in the US, where they're very global, a huge portion is overseas, companies that are more regional or 90%, let's say US based, they people think about ISO 20022 primarily from, okay, we got to move to a standard payment format. It's not as linked and thought about as some of the companies that are dealing with this on a larger basis. And I look at ISO 20022 and the corporate treasurer thinks about it differently from the bankers we talk to and the people that are part of the payment and messaging systems. What's changing, on a corporate side, we think about what comes out of the system, what we put into the system, and it's like, oh, it's going to be ISO 20022, or I like my BAI2 or my MT formats. All of the underlying messaging is moving to this new standard. And so how you enter it on the outside matters. How it matters is, probably part of our discussion there. But this idea that these standards are coming out and being put in place, or they've been put in place for some time, matters pretty significantly. And I would say anytime you touch a payment and you're making a change, you should be going to an ISO 20022. If you touch it, change it to a new standard that has a lifespan that's going to go out more than a decade. Move it to a PAIN 001 format. Move it to, which is part of the ISO standard. Move it there so that you're not reworking stuff in 5 years and 3 years. And so you can take advantage of what these new formats have in store. And so I think that there's some that are very mature in their thinking on ISO 20022, and others are, I'll just say, there's room to grow. And I find the more global organizations, or those organizations that are in Europe, tend to be thinking about that a little more readily, especially since there's a few standards for that. The other part you mentioned, open banking APIs, this idea of embedded interoperability. Banks are thinking about it. Tech firms are thinking about it. It's just a way to make things easier, reduce the friction. These are so vital for organizations that want to scale, that want to achieve visibility, that want efficiency, that want better security and control. I don't think there's any area where things aren't improved with some of this better connectivity and better formats that come down. And so I guess I moved off of just the US context, but all of these change. Maybe we can think of it this way. We think of people move from technology from one mountain to the other, right? We're crossing this chasm. But usually the reality is there's several mountains that we're crossing, right? And so the farthest mountain away is tech that's going away. And then people are jumping to the new mountain. They're on the current mountain, which is, established tech and then newer tech. There's so much that's changing. Our accounting systems, our treasury systems, our use of data for things like not just machine learning, but business intelligence to analyze what's going on, using and leveraging the data across all of these systems. All of those are changes, and I would say that the context is, I'm trying to say this in a way that's, we're not thinking about how radical this change is and what we need to do as consistently. Less than half of companies, I think, are thinking about the extent of this change and what this requires over the next 5 years, move to the new tech. Patrick was voted the representative for Europe for that view, right? Okay.
Waving the EU flag now, which is immediately a challenge, because yes, we might have one standard in the EU, we might have one currency, we still have a little bit north-south. We have big banks, small banks, some of them being very advanced on the ISO standard, some of them are even lagging behind, both on a corporate level, but also on a banking level. I think the key goal, to put all these 3 keywords that you used, John, the end goal is standardization, and building on what Craig said there, make sure you build a process now which is future-proof. You don't have to touch it for 5-10 years Maybe you touch it again if AI is blown up, or we all go to blockchain, or there's a new tech which hasn't been invented yet. But for now, we should build a process that's future-proof, that's on a standard that's going to live long. So the ISO standard is the way to go, in my opinion. But there's some work to be done on a corporate level to make sure that works, both on an ERP level, on a banking level, and on an IT level. And those three, that triangle, needs to work together, because you're only as good as your weakest chain. And if you are the weakest chain, you have work to do. The weakest chain might also be your bank, so you also need to talk to your banks. Hey guys, are you able to process the standard I'm sending you? And believe it or not, I'm seeing too often that a client has one ISO standard, even the main one, XML format, but then 9 out of 10 banks accept it. One bank says, no, I have different requirements. I need this field to be filled with this code. I need this field to be added to the format. So in the end, I end up with having 2, 3, 4 different formats, but in the same format, but bank-specific coding, which is annoying. It requires extra work, extra maintenance, extra standards. But if that's the way to go, okay, fair. As long as you are on a standard which lives long, because you definitely have to go away from the MX standard and MT standards, and especially on the older payment types, which are not of these. It's 2024, so you have to live up to these standards. Also make use of these standards. The ISO standard it's very rich format. It gives you more information than the old standards give you opportunities for payments, but also on the bank statement side, the information coming in. More rich format, more data means more information, better information. Maybe lastly on the APIs, open banking, it's being enforced in the EU. All the banks have to offer an API. To be honest, it's the very basic one, which the banks have to offer. It's payments and very basic statements, which works. On the basis, it works. So use the API. You can be live with a bank on connectivity within a week if you want to, on the basics. But you have to ask yourself, are the basics good enough for me? For this client with 50 to 200 million turnover, it might be okay. For my 1 billion plus turnover clients, it's definitely not okay. They need more information, or the processing time of the formats is too slow, or the files are too big. So they end up creating their own standard. So there's definitely potential on the API side. There are APIs out there. I don't think the market is transparent enough yet, and mature enough yet. There's definitely a room for improvement there, because too often I get the question from the client, I have these lists of banks, how do we connect with them? And in the end, we end up connecting host to host with 30% of the bank, API with another 30%, another one via EBIX, another one via Swift. So we end up having 100% connectivity, but maybe 4 or 5 different connection types, because in the end, it depends on the bank, how you connect to them. A little bit on the software, but there's no one size fits it all or one connection fits it all, which is the holy grail for all bank connectivity and all client connectivity. So there's not this one API in the world where all the banks can connect with and all the corporates yet. Making use of aggregators in between definitely helps. They provide the APIs, or TMS vendors, payment hub vendors. They have their own APIs. Very helpful. It speeds up the implementation process. But I think the end goal, it's near, but we aren't there yet. There's definitely room for improvement on connectivity projects, because in the end they take they take time. They take time, planning, and resources to make them a success.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting position that corporates are in right now, is that you have a lot of these technology initiatives that are sort of in flight, but aren't, fully mature yet. You mentioned, open banking APIs that are going to present tremendous advantages to corporates in terms of access to data. Also onboarding, which I thought was a great point, that, speeding up the time to actually get live with your banks. But there's still a lot of maturity still to happen there before they really meet all the use cases of particularly the more complex corporates out there, right? So that's sort of still a journey for most companies out there. The ISO 20022 standard, which hasn't become the norm yet, but everybody knows that migration is coming up, right? But you're sort of sitting in between legacy formats and the ISO standard right now for corporates. And like the key there is, how do you make sure that you are future-proof and make sure that you're able to adopt these standards when the time comes? Either you're required to because the regulation shifts, or because you want to because there's a business advantage to doing so. That's a really interesting place for corporates to be in right now as they're formulating their strategy. Also some really important times, I would say, to collaborate with IT, kind of like the tone of this conversation here today. ISO 20022 migrations, it could be that a lot of IT departments are not even aware that this is coming up, that there's going to be sort of a fundamental shift in the formats that they're using, both for outbound payments and inbound reporting, and there could be some work to do on the ERP side to be able to support that. Or if you don't have a different technology solution in the middle there that's sort of helping to translate that for you. So an important conversation, I think, to have with IT. Also from the standpoint you brought up, Patrick, is this is a more efficient format. It's a more data-rich format. It's more standardized. So it could be that you want to adopt this, particularly if you're kind of opening things up now, and it's the opportunity to do so, because there's certainly a lot of advantages to that. Also cloud ERP migrations, is another big one to collaborate with IT on, because the bank connectivity piece could be a real make or break for that project in terms of if you're really going to get the value out of that investment that you want to. The goal of that is one business on one unified ERP for most companies for the first time ever. And you want to make sure you get all the efficiencies, the standardizations, the automations, the reporting that can bring for a company, and bank connectivity is obviously going to be a key piece to that as well. I did hear both you guys give like sort of a cautious, view on this, like sort of be careful. Maybe this isn't getting as much attention as it deserves in some organizations. So maybe we could jump here and talk a little bit to, what are the repercussions potentially for corporates if you don't have really a strategy around this? What could potentially go wrong, or what are the pitfalls you could fall into? And Patrick, maybe I'll go to you first with this point here.
Well, if you're not up to date and the deadline reached, you might not be able to do automated payments from your ERP system. You might not be able to process bank statements anymore. Okay, this is an extreme case scenario, but this could happen, and I foresee that some clients might be surprised. Hey, this is coming to us. I didn't even know I wasn't ready, or that I needed to change. So have a look internally. Do I need to change? Am I up to date with all my standards? And don't underestimate it, because you might think, okay, it's just changing from one standard to another one. What are the changes that I need to make? Maybe from a Treasury perspective, that's fairly easy. But if you need IT or other departments, SAP, ERP, maybe even support from your vendors, then you're dependent on their timelines. They're out of your control. I've seen clients where IT came back, maybe we have time in 6 months. That there was a real answer, because they had other priorities, because they were doing ERP implementations. They said, okay, I don't have time to look at new formats or anything. And it wasn't in scope in the current implementation. So don't underestimate the timelines. 3 to 6 months, pretty normal to make a change. And that's without even encountering problems. You might encounter a problem which is like, okay, my current ERP system doesn't even support it. What do we do now? Do we need an aggregator in between? Do we need to build the tool, buy a tool, implement that? It can be very tricky. There's a lot of discussion ongoing on the ISO standard with the address field. The address field in the new ISO standard has separate fields for the address, the number, the postal codes, and the details. Well, some ERP systems have the address field in one field. So if you put one field into 5 fields, yeah, that's very difficult to do. If you have a bank who requires all 5 fields to be filled, that's going to be an issue. Are you going to back to all your master data and change that? If you're a $1 billion company, good luck with that. That requires planning, and I think that's the key. Try to predict, look 1 or 2 years ahead. How much time do I have? How much resources do I have? And let's plan that project early on. You should have already started. That's maybe my last advice.
Yeah, these are mission critical processes here, your payments processes, your reconciliation processes, and you certainly want to be able to do these changes under a controlled environment, not forced because you have actively payment files failing because, to your point, you're not adopting to the latest standards. So definitely something corporates are going to want to consider now. Yeah, I mean, to make sure that they're prepared for a lot of these changes, even on the API front, just having a strategy, I think, for how you're going to adopt more modern connectivity protocols as those use cases come is valuable for corporates too. Just thinking this stuff through and sort of folding it into a more comprehensive strategy, I think is definitely important. Craig, I don't know if you had any other points maybe to add on this topic in terms of repercussions of failing to have a strategy, or some pointers here that we could give to some of the companies listening.
Yeah, I want to reemphasize what Patrick said about just an example of a change. The address information has to be sent along. And let's say you have 4 systems that generate payments or 10 systems. Now that work has to be redone. All the formats have to be redone. So it's like Sisyphus, where rolls the rock up the hill, only to have it roll down. He does this every single day throughout eternity. Don't get the gods ticked off, I guess, is the lesson there. But the same element. Why recreate this across every domain that you have, and recreate it like, if some of these formats have been around for multiple decades, since some of us were born, certainly since we've had our careers. Now these changes are coming more quickly, and so we need to have a more flexible system. That's part of the strategy that I think we've all been talking about. You have to be able to be flexible, and the shift is underway. We're undergoing significant change. Whether you want to argue about change will come more rapidly in shorter cycles, that could be a fun debate, but the reality is the shift is underway to new technology, to new formats, to new methods of connecting. So how are you going to handle that? Are you going to repeat the practice many, many times, which is a failure, right? If I do the same thing 10 times, because the first time was a little easier than making and coming up with a strategy that lets me solve it for AP, for Treasury, for an admin system, for my recon platform or platforms, for my third ERP that we didn't quite get done away with. We don't want to repeat those practices many times. And this is the point of change for your organizations. And there's one other thing that I just wanted to mention about, just because you have a richer format, like why is, if we say ISO 20022 is a standard for formats, we usually use a form of XML to create it. And so there might be payment format like PAIN 001 or CAMP messages or other messages. We start using those interchangeably. So if you're new to the discussion, why do we keep throwing in different terms when we're really talking about essentially the same thing? That's just the disease we have, right? We say those types of things. But just because you have more flexibility, in an XML message where you can stick more data, on the inbound side, if your bank doesn't provide more data, it doesn't give you much more advantages. It's just a better format, more flexible. But you want to use that to leverage, here's the data that comes back, because now Treasury uses this, accounts receivable uses this, Recon uses this other data. And so that's part of, are your banks keeping up? And just because they have a better format doesn't mean they put better information there. It's a richer format. Did they make the format and the contents richer? So those are some other elements that I just felt compelled to say.
Yeah, definitely critical points too. Yeah, I think the other one that we haven't called attention to on the inbound side is that the switch to ISO formats, when it does come in the future, if you built your reconciliation process so that your ERP or your reconciliation module is expecting an MT statement or a BAI format, and suddenly your bank's only providing a CAMT format, then you're going to have all sorts of issues on the back end side where you haven't really restructured your processes to expect that new format. You're going to have to come up with a strategy there as well, right? So that's definitely another repercussion that we're seeing. But I think it's interesting, bringing up the specific point that you guys did around the unstructured address line needing to go to those structured segments in the XML file. I think it's a good example of how nuanced these changes are going to be. It's not like, oh, you could previously provide a CSV to your bank and now you have to send them a NACHA. It's going to be sort of a lot more nuanced than that in terms of how the banks expect certain information to be structured within these XML files, and how that will ultimately change over time as they go from, say, XML v3 to XML v9, and what that's going to mean on the IT department. So definitely a lot to consider there, and definitely something to sort of begin planning now, as Patrick pointed out, in terms of your strategy for ISO migration. Not to just scare everybody with some of these changes that are coming down the pipeline here, maybe we could move into some of the solutions, best practices, some of the opportunities out there for corporates to maybe use some tools that are out there in the market or something along those lines to be able to address some of these ISO changes that are coming down, or even to put in place a more holistic bank connectivity strategy, like we said before, is kind of future-proof, right? It's really looking forward, and it's going to support the business on an ongoing basis. So, Craig, maybe you could kick us off here with a couple of best practices that you've seen for companies putting in place a strategy to address some of these factors.
Yeah, so what are the best practices? What are the leading practices that might be more specific to your organization? I think the first one would be know and discuss what's going on, like some of the items that you brought up and had us discuss. There's a lot of change going on with the tech, where data is processed, formats that are being used, the use of APIs, the growth and value of data in an organization and leveraging that. So know and discuss what's going on, how that's shifting, how that shift is occurring, and what that will mean to the organization. The second area about knowing and discussing is, what do you plan to do about that in light of, I'll just say, your level of corporate complexity? Are you simple, complex, or hyper complex? If you're a company, you deal with one bank, you do 2 payment types, you get 1 information reporting piece of information back in, it's all simple. You don't have to worry about as much of this as when you have 2 ERPs, 3 other systems that get data, 5 payment generating systems with 8 banks across 15 countries and 7 currencies. You move from simple to complex to hyper complex. And so the leading practice, or the best practice, is to have a plan and a strategy that takes into account where you are and where you're going from I'll call it a payment and an information complexity standpoint. The simplest organizations, they're not on this call, they're not talking about it. It's like, hey, I use QuickBooks, I've got 1 bank, I've got 3 accounts. They're not covering that information. And so that's one of the first leading practices. And another area that's probably still from a leading practice perspective is, when we plan and strategize, we also need to come up with a prioritization of how we connect, what formats we use, because Patrick gave a good example of 30% is connected with APIs, 30% might be connected with Swift or eBix, and I can't remember the numbers. He was just giving some examples of, we're shifting, and because we're shifting, it's not like we can just go and say, we're going to be a full API shop tomorrow. We are shifting, but that shift takes some time. And so how do we prioritize our decisions? It's got to fit into, what does our future state look like, so that every change we make fits into our future state, unless it's absolutely not possible. Not that it's a little bit harder. So I'm connecting with better formats. I'm connecting with better connection methods. I'm getting richer data. Host to host or Swift. Well, let's go Swift. And this is just an example. Host to host or API, and I have 1 connection, API covers it, or I've got six API setups that work. Okay, I want to go that way. And so that's how we think about that. And then the other is, how do we do that? Do we do that internally, or do we use the vendors that we have, our ERP or Treasury system, our recon platform, or do we use the functionality of an aggregator, part of the reason why you have this discussion here, right? So how can I lever that and make sense of it? And so are we making a solution and a plan that solves the enterprise level issues, or am I solving everything on a one-off individualized basis? And I think those are some of the key leading practices. The other one would be that has to be done in the context of data. Data matters. How we solve this has to be done in light of how the company is going to leverage data for everybody who's $1 billion in revenue and up.
Yeah, I think a lot of good points there in terms of how to put in place that strategy, that roadmap in terms of how you're ultimately going to introduce some of these technologies into the business. Patrick, I don't know if you have anything you could add to that potentially here as well.
A little bit. It's basically what Craig said. Plus people. Don't underestimate the people aspect. It's people who have to do it. So design cross-functional teams with each of their expertise. But what I often do is in my projects, if the client, especially the treasury team, relies too much on IT, the vendor, or me, on technical knowledge, I always tell them, get involved, at least make an effort to learn the basics. What's the difference between host to host and API? Try to read an XML message so you at least understand how they are built. What are the critical fields in an XML message? During the tens of implementations I've done, I could write one of these XMLs, even though I don't want to do it. I can at least read them, because often I see for the smaller-ish mid-sized companies, the IT department also doesn't know. They've never seen XML messages. They've never worked with APIs. They also struggle. Even you would say, you're the IT guys, you should know, but sometimes they don't. So it really helps from a treasury side to have basic knowledge and steer them in the right direction. Hey, it's this field or the connectivity is failing because of this reason. Can you look into it? That can help hours or days or weeks in a project. At least that's what I've seen from my experience. So a treasurer with technical knowledge, at least the basics, it helps. And it's 2024. A treasurer without IT knowledge, it's going to be a struggle. Keep up with it. That's going to help you in your career as well.
Yeah, for sure. It does seem like there's an expectation to have some level of technical knowledge on these topics when you're in the treasury field now, to be able to enable technology projects, automations, and things like that. So that's a great pointer to give out there. Also the one about, does IT have the knowledge and I guess the appetite to really address these? I think is a good topic too. I mean, like we mentioned, there's a lot of complexities here. You have to be a technical expert on quite a lot of different things in terms of bank protocols, APIs, almost bring like a developer aspect into integrating up with your bank partners. Format building is very nuanced, right? There's variations depending on geographies. So you have to be able to consider all these geographic nuances, all these sort of regulatory nuances of building these payment formats. It's just a lot for somebody to keep up on, sort of as a part-time job to help support Treasury. So definitely look for, if you don't have that internal knowledge, there's a lot of solutions out there that can really help, sort of lift a lot of that responsibility off of Treasury and arm Treasury with a toolkit to be able to address a lot of this on their own via like a specialized software, right? So you're not so reliant on those IT resources to make these changes, to support new bank integrations, to support migrations to protocols, right? So definitely keep that in mind, I think, as you're creating that technology roadmap and really assessing how the business is going to move forward from a bank connectivity standpoint. I do want to make sure we leave some time for questions, because I do anticipate we're going to have a few here on this topic, considering how technical it is. But maybe we could finish up here with just a sort of a wrap up, call it a call to action, or like a key item you want the listeners to remember here. I think we hit a little bit of this in the last point, but I'm not sure if you guys have anything else. Maybe we can start with Craig. It's just sort of, what's your key takeaway from this conversation? What would you say to the listeners?
So a couple things, change is being forced upon us. Know the complexity of your organization and have conversations with those who can advise you, your banks, consulting firms, technology firms that focus on this. you have to recognize that the change is coming upon us. It's here, and it's progressing, and it matters to your organization. The other thing is, don't if you're a treasurer, you need to understand some things about technology, enough to know how you can achieve visibility and flexibility. You don't have to know all the details. What's the 56F record? You don't need to know those things, but knowing some of the differences between an API, a host-to-host connection from a connectivity standpoint, understanding some of the differences in formats and what that can mean, and don't rely on the information that was maybe you learned 15 years ago or 12 weeks ago or one instance showed it, and think that applies across the board. So continue to challenge that, which means if you're a treasurer, have other people who can inform that. If you're a manager, director level, you may need to know things in more depth, enough to guide your organization to make those right types of decisions and priorities. If you have a plan, you have a prioritization structure, you will do far better than not. And I guess the last point, I guess I'm kind of going on a while, but you used the term future-proof, and Patrick, I think, described it really well. He said, like, how do you future-proof? And he said, well, there's other changes that can come up. And so, if you're a skeptic, you're like, hey, well, that's not future-proof because there can be other changes. But the reality is, future-proof means giving yourself the best opportunity for success in the runway we can see, and be able to adjust as those come up. Because 25 years from now, who knows what's going to occur? Think about how data moves inside an organization. Some organizations it's file-based, it's scheduled once a week. Others have a streaming method of moving data around the organization between different systems. Those are very different organizations, and the change is happening. So think about how do you give yourself the best opportunity for success.
I like it. What can I add to this? Start early. I think that's the best advice, because your timelines will stretch. You will come up with issues which you haven't foreseen, with problems which cannot be solved very easily, quickly, or where you need external help to solve it. And build cross-functional teams. One expert from each of the processes involved. Somebody from Treasury, IT, ERP, middleware, you name it. Make sure you have a team of experts who keep each other informed, meet regularly, keep each other updated. And maybe lastly, there's not necessarily one solution that's going to be the best. There are multiple ones which are all going to work. Different ways to connect, different ways to build a structure, which is all future-proof. It's going to depend on the choices you make, the budget you have, and the system landscape you have. So don't necessarily see what others have and copy that. Do some research in the market, the different tools out there, the different ways to connect out there, and then decide internally what's going to fit best for my organization, both from a treasury perspective, but also from an IT perspective and technology perspective. Because if it's best for IT and it's not going to fit for treasury, that's still a no, and the other way around as well. So start early, because it gives you time to inform yourself what's out there in the market, and gives you time to implement in a timely manner instead of in a stressful manner, because you have deadlines coming up.
No, both really good points. I'm not sure there's much I can add on to it either, but maybe I'll hit back to a point that I think Craig made earlier in the conversation that maybe we didn't touch upon enough, is that the bank connectivity strategy is more than just about fueling automation, financial process automation within your business. It's really a key part of your overall data strategy. I think Treasury is probably one of the most I guess comprehensive suppliers and users of data within the office of the CFO. And if this bank connectivity topic isn't handled well, and you have a lot of regionalized processes set up for bank connectivity where all that data is not being aggregated in a centralized place, that can really have bad impacts on further downstream, data analytics processes and things like that as well. So definitely think of it from that standpoint too, is bringing that data together in a comprehensive way that can really be used effectively by the business to fuel downstream automations and tangential departments to Treasury, as well as your broader data analytics strategy, I think is a key thing to think about when you're putting in place your bank connectivity strategy too. But overall, great conversation, guys. Thanks a lot for your participation here today. Maybe we'll bring Jen back on the screen here for a moment and see if any questions came in from the listeners.
Sure thing. Really, Craig, Patrick, John, fantastic conversation. We did have 5 questions roll in. The first one came in from Annalise pretty early on in your conversation, asking what kind of connection would you personally recommend for a company that would start a bank connectivity project in the coming years? Is API connection more future-proof? Who'd like that one?
Yes. Yeah, I could take it. Probably yes. If the bank offers it and if the corporate can handle it. That's the it depends answer. But probably yes, API is the more modern one. But that doesn't mean a host-to-host SFTP connection, which is a proven concept for the last 20 years. You know what? It still works, and it's also very easy to implement a host-to-host connection. So API sounds fancy, and if it does the trick, do it. But if it doesn't work, a host-to-host works perfectly fine as well.
I think this is one we all wish there was a simple answer to, but I think the answer I would give was you'll have to dig into the maturity of the API itself that the bank offers, and ultimately what you're trying to facilitate with it, because I guess the capabilities and maturity of the APIs between different banks just is varying so much these days that, say for example, your primary objective is just bank reporting, for real-time cash positioning or cash forecasting. That might be a really easy use case for most open banking APIs to solve. But say you're trying to drive a global payments process that focuses on really large batch payments and things like that coming out of multiple regions. Could be that the bank's API is not yet sophisticated enough to handle those. So you really have to kind of, I think, dig into both sides of the equation there to make sure you pick the right method. And like we mentioned, I think that's the interesting place corporates are in right now, is that they don't want to adopt legacy, but maybe what's going on now isn't mature enough to really support the real business use case. So think about that migration journey in the future too, whether that is something you tackle internally or something you tackle through third-party software might be a good thing to consider as well.
Yeah, it's hard to say here's a particular standard of API networks like Swift3, BIX, and then host to host. That could be your starting point, and then there's all these factors: how much volume are you transmitting, how much is going back and forth, the maturity of those elements, how important is that bank, is it information, is it payments? Those factor into it. But having some of those guidelines, so you have to say, this is what we want to shoot for first, here are the discussion points, now we make a decision that makes sense for today and the future. And sometimes you have to use just say a little bit less desirable tech because the tech isn't mature enough, I think, to both of your points. But an API first strategy doesn't mean API only. It's just one way to look at it. You have to evaluate those things. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your answers. Moving on to question 2. This one came in from Robin. And the question is, what is the deadline for when corporates are expected to migrate to ISO 20022 formats for outbound payments and inbound electronic bank statements? Second part of this question, we anticipate this will require heavy involvement from our IT, so they are trying to determine the timelines. I'd like to jump in on that.
I think unfortunately those timelines aren't perfectly clear right now. So there is a deadline that's been set, November 2025, for interbank messages to all follow the ISO XML standard, right? But that's obviously just communication between two banking partners. Those same expectations are not being passed down to corporates immediately as of that timeline. But that being said, we brought up a couple examples already of stuff that we're already hearing in the market. For example, that whole conversation we had around the unstructured address field no longer being allowed, needing to move to the structured address segments that's creeping in. I heard 2026 on that one. So I'm not sure anybody will communicate a hard deadline. It might almost be a bank by bank sort of migration based on what they're expecting from their corporate customers. I think that's kind of a little bit what's scary about it too, is that we don't know exactly when that standard's going to change. But I don't know if you guys have any other sort of context you can give around that point.
Yeah, I even heard some banks struggling with the 25 deadline because their systems aren't ready or it's too big of a project. So probably even that one is going to be a fluid one. But that doesn't mean, it only means for the corporate you're getting more time. But still, if you start now, you have more time. You can take it more easy to work on it. So yeah, no hard deadline yet, but be ready. There is a deadline now. It's not very hard, but there's a deadline.
Yeah, these deadlines tend to shift, and just think about how quickly things move and how quickly life goes on. A year is nothing. 2 years is nothing. And so, if the bank-to-bank, stuff is, even if that's pushed off, banks are going to try to support their customers to the extent they can. But if you're coming in with an old standard from the outside, you're missing options, data, flexibility to receive information back. And then if you can't include some of the data, now you're what? Going into the bank portal, adding in 4 fields where you didn't have the information? That's a horrible process. So these changes are taking place over time. They take place more readily within the banking system, between banks to banks, banks to the main, central bank, payment rails and SWIFT and other ones are all standardizing on that. Even MT 101 and 103s, that process of being decommissioned is underway. Now, that doesn't mean that your bank won't accept it. They'll probably try to leave it hanging on, but it's there's a point where it doesn't have to be an immediate panic, but you should move there. There was a comic strip, a funnies or cartoon that said, with your phone, it said, press 1 for this, press 2 for this, press 3 for this. And if you have a rotary phone, please hang up. We don't want your business. And so it's like, you want to do business with how your customers can work, but there gets to be a point where it gets to be too difficult. And so that's kind of the humorous way of looking at it. But you want to stay current with technology. You don't want to be, I want to be the last 2% who move off of, paper-based wire instructions, or, some weird format. Move to the better, richer formats. They're better for security. They're better for enriched data. And so plan your moves.
Perfect.
What's a rotary phone, Craig?
A rotary phone is when you were a child, your parents probably had. Yeah, like.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to actually combine Liam and Lynn's questions just in the spirit of the coming up against time here. Liam asks, how early on the process is it recommended to involve IT? And Lynn's is, what are some of the common types of pushbacks from IT that we could address?
Patrick already said right away, so that's part of the answer, right? Pushback is we're planning something different. And so the pushback might be we have a whole communication strategy that we're working on. We want to do it on our own. That could be one. And 2, maybe if you're thinking of solving everything individually, they may say we want to solve this at an enterprise level, and that's good news. You want to be part of that discussion. Treasury is going to be one of the leaders in terms of a business area that gets into that. I'd start off with that.
Yeah, those are good ones, I think. I mean, Patrick, I think, did mention multiple times, definitely include them as early as possible, and I'd agree with that completely. We've heard organizations have a freeze on like new IT projects, 6, 12 months, whatever it might be, but it's hard to get those resources involved in most corporations. They don't have IT resources just sort of sitting around waiting for the next project, so I definitely agree with that one. Yeah, and then the pushback items, I think I'd agree with Craig. It's about, we think we can handle this in-house, maybe underestimating the complexity of something, or maybe trying to direct Treasury towards something the business already has that they think can meet the need that Treasury sort of knows won't meet the need. Because obviously from the IT standpoint, you might not want to bring in multiple solutions or multiple vendors because it just means, additional connections or additional, I guess, suppliers to manage and things like that. So that's commonly the pushback, but it's usually overcome, but just showing the value, I guess, and sort of what Treasury is doing, and maybe enlightening IT a little bit to the complexity. Like we mentioned on this ISO topic, it's hugely complex, and there's not probably a lot of IT teams out there that really understand the nuances of sort of what's coming, and maybe just sort of better educating the IT resources on that, help you to overcome some of those objectives, because I do believe they're here to help at the end of the day. Yeah.
Okay, and I think based on time, we really only have time for one more question. This one came in from Kapil. Considering various bank connecting alternatives, what do you think about using third-party services, payment aggregators, as you may have host-to-host, SWIFT, and API with different banks and currencies?
It's a great solution. It makes sense. It often makes sense, and it helps be live quicker to use them. It might be more expensive in some cases, but trading it off against time and being live faster, that often means it's more efficient. Definitely makes sense, especially if you don't have the in-house resources to build all these connections, to maintain all these connections. Because what Craig said, what John said, there's not going to be one connection with all of your banks, or one similar connection even. So it makes sense to have parties in between, definitely.
Yeah, as you move up in complexity, if you're talking to your neighbor, you could set up a string with a cup, and then you talk over that. It's the same language. It's easy enough. That's pre-rotary phone, Patrick, if you never had that growing up. But the string, you talk through it. But if we have phones. We don't have 12 phones on our desk. You have one phone. You punch in numbers. You connect to different people. The fact that there might be different languages that they speak. If you had a service where you could have one phone, you touch the numbers, and they translated it to your home, your native language, you're going to say that's a lot easier, especially if you're connecting to 20 or 10 or 100. If they handle all of that for you, that's a lot easier than saying, how am I going to handle each of these connections running strings across to each company? So you rapidly get to the complex and hyper complex. And so having specialties makes sense. We have that with our phones. We have that with, data connectivity. We have that in a number of areas where there's advantages to doing that. So we think that makes sense for a lot of companies.
Yeah, I'd say so too. Particularly, we called attention to how much things are changing. I think a lot of these providers can really help manage that change as well. Even the first question that came in about should I use API or host-to-host connection to connect up to my bank, and we said depends on the maturity. What a third-party software can allow you to do is connect through host-to-host today, maybe if that's the right option to fuel your whatever business processes are flowing through. But then your provider probably provides both connections, host-to-host and API connections, and allows you to migrate to the API when it does reach the maturity that it meets your business needs, right? So it reduces that complexity on IT and leaves you more open. Same on these ISO topics. A lot of these providers can do format transformations. So if you're providing, say, a local format like a BAX format today, and you need that converted into an ISO XML format, that can be accomplished within the software without the effort from the IT department. Same with the inbound side. We talked about how there could be disruption to the reconciliation process if you've set your systems up to expect MT files or BAI files, and suddenly your banks start providing CAMT files. They can convert that CAMT into the MT and allow you to sort of have the time to manage that change on the ERP side and not be sort of forced into that and create process disruption. So it's definitely a flexible tool, particularly with how much things are changing right now.
I like how you came up with the ISO XML file. You threw that in as another term. It's awesome.
Great. Thank you so much for your answers. Everyone, thank you so much for your questions. Just a reminder that there are some content assets in the download section or in the handout section for you to download. With that, I'll hand this back to you, John.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jen. Thanks for those questions. Awesome questions, and once again, guys, thanks a lot for the conversation. I thought it was a great chat. I think it's a very complex technical topic, but I think we did a good job keeping at the practical level and not dragging too much into the weeds. So hopefully the listeners enjoyed the conversation here today. I would say if anybody has any additional questions or wants to learn more about any of the topics that we discussed, I know I'm open. I'm sure Patrick and Craig are as well. Feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or through email. We're happy to continue the conversation there. But otherwise, guys, thanks again for joining the Coffee Talk session here today. I really appreciate the conversation.
It was a pleasure.
All right. And thanks to all of our listeners as well. Hope you guys enjoyed the conversation as well. And we hope to see you in the next Coffee Talk.